Her reservations grew during her first speaking engagement after the visitation, before an audience of people recently paralyzed and now wheelchair bound. Janice delivered her usual words of inspiration, assuring them that they had the strength needed for the challenges ahead. It was during the Q&A that she was asked if the restoration of her legs meant she had passed her test. Janice didn't know what to say. She could hardly promise them that one day their marks would be raised. In fact, she realized any implication that she'd been rewarded could be interpreted as criticism of others who remained afflicted, and she didn't want that. All she could tell them was that she didn't know why she'd been cured, but it was obvious they found that an unsatisfying answer. Janice returned home disquieted. She still believed in her message, but as far as her audiences were concerned, she'd lost her greatest source of credibility. How could she inspire others who were touched by God to see their condition as a badge of strength when she no longer shared their condition? She considered whether this might be a challenge, a test of her ability to spread His word. Clearly, God had made her task more difficult than it was before. Perhaps the restoration of her legs was an obstacle for her to overcome, just as their earlier removal had been. This interpretation failed her at her next scheduled engagement. The audience was a group of witnesses to a visitation by Nathaniel. She was often invited to speak to such groups in the hopes that those who suffered might draw encouragement from her. Rather than sidestep the issue, she began with an account of the visitation she herself had recently experienced. She explained that while it might appear she was a beneficiary, she was in fact facing her own challenge. Like them, she was being forced to draw on resources previously untapped. She realized too late that she had said the wrong thing. A man in the audience with the mishapen leg stood up and challenged her. Was she seriously suggesting that the restoration of her legs was comparable to the loss of his wife? Could she really be equating her trials with his own? Janice immediately assured him that she wasn't and that she couldn't imagine the pain he was experiencing. But, she said, it wasn't God's intention that everyone be subjected to the same kind of trial, but only that each person face his or her own trial, whatever it might be. The difficulty of any trial was subjective, and there was no way to compare two individuals' experiences. And just as those whose suffering seemed greater than his should have compassion for him, so should he have compassion for those whose suffering seemed less. The man was having none of it. She had received what anyone else would have considered a fantastic blessing, and she was complaining about it. He stormed out of the meeting while Janice was still trying to explain. That man, of course, was Neil Fisk. Neil had had Janice Riley's name mentioned to him for much of his life, most often by people who were convinced his misshapen leg was a sign from God. These people cited her as an example he should follow, telling him that her attitude was the proper response to a physical handicap. Neil couldn't deny that her leglessness was a far worse condition than his distorted femur. Unfortunately, he found her attitude so foreign that, even in the best of times, he'd never been able to learn anything from her. Now, in the depths of his grief and mystified as to why she had received a gift she didn't need, Neil found her words offensive. In the days that followed, Janice found herself more and more plagued by doubts, unable to decide what the restoration of her legs meant. Was she being ungrateful for a gift she'd received? Was it both a blessing and a test? Perhaps it was a punishment, an indication that she had not performed her duty well enough. There were many possibilities, and she didn't know which one to believe. There is one other person who played an important role in Neil's story, even though he and Neil did not meet until Neil's journey was nearly over. That person's name is Ethan Mead. Ethan had been raised in a family that was devout, but not profoundly so. His parents credited God with their above average health and their comfortable economic status, although they hadn't witnessed any visitations or received any visions. They simply trusted that God was, directly or indirectly, responsible for their good fortune. Their devotion had never been put to any serious test and might not have withstood one. Their love for God was based on their satisfaction with the status quo. Ethan was not like his parents, though. Ever since childhood, he'd felt certain that God had a special role for him to play, and he waited for a sign telling him what that role was. He'd like to have become a preacher, but felt he hadn't any compelling testimony to offer. His vague feelings of expectation weren't enough. He longed for an encounter with the divine to provide him with direction. He could have gone to one of the holy sites, those places where, for reasons unknown, angelic visitations occurred on a regular basis, but he felt that such an action would be presumptuous of him. The holy sites were usually the last resort of the desperate, those people seeking either a miracle cure to repair their bodies or a glimpse of heaven's light to repair their souls, and Ethan was not desperate. He decided that he'd been set along his own course, and in time the reason for it would become clear. While waiting for that day, he lived his life as best he could. He worked as a librarian, married a woman named Claire, raised 2 children. All the while, he remained watchful for signs of a greater destiny. Ethan was certain his time had come when he became witness to a visitation by Rachiel, the same visitation that, miles away, restored Jenny Israeli's legs. Ethan was by himself when it happened. He was walking toward his car in the center of a parking lot when the ground began to shudder. Instinctively, he knew it was a visitation, and he assumed a kneeling position, feeling no fear, only exhilaration and awe at the prospect of learning his calling. The ground became still after a minute, and Ethan looked around but didn't otherwise move. Only after waiting for several more minutes did he rise to his feet. There was a large crack in the asphalt, beginning directly in front of him and following a meandering path down the street. The crack seemed to be pointing him in a specific direction, so he ran alongside it for several blocks until he encountered other survivors, a man and a woman climbing out of a modest fissure that had opened up directly beneath them. He waited with the 2 of them until rescuers arrived and brought them to a shelter. Ethan attended the support group meetings that followed and met the other witnesses to Rachiel's visitation. Over the course of a few meetings, he became aware of certain patterns among the witnesses. Of course, there were those who'd been injured and those who'd received miracle cures. But there were also those whose lives were changed in other ways. The man and woman he'd first met fell in love and were soon engaged. A woman who'd been pinned beneath a collapsed wall was inspired to become an EMT after being rescued. One business owner formed an alliance that averted her impending bankruptcy, while another whose business was destroyed saw it as a message that he changed his ways. It seemed that everyone except Ethan had found a way to understand what had happened to them. He hadn't been cursed or blessed in any obvious way, and he didn't know what message he was intended to receive. His wife Claire suggested that he consider the visitation a reminder that he appreciate what he had, but Ethan found that unsatisfying, reasoning that every visitation, no matter where it occurred, served that function, and the fact that he'd witnessed a visitation firsthand had to have greater significance. His mind was preyed upon by the idea that he missed an opportunity, that there was a fellow witness whom he was intended to meet but hadn't. This visitation had to be the sign he'd been waiting for. He couldn't just disregard it, but that didn't tell him what he was supposed to do. Ethan eventually resorted to the process of elimination. He got hold of a list of all the witnesses and crossed off those who had a clear interpretation of their experience, reasoning that one of those remaining must be the person whose fate was somehow intertwined with his. Among those who were confused or uncertain about the visitation's meaning would be the one he was intended to meet. When he had finished crossing names off his list, there was only one left: Janice Riley.